Kia ora koutou, ko Lauren Peate toku ingoa, and I'm working on the rest of my mihi, but we'll start with that for now. So you can see what I'm going to be talking about today, and for those of you that were in Brooke's session, it builds nicely on a comment that she said around how so often we focus on the products and the services that we're creating, but it's just as important, and I might argue even more important, how we actually create those. And the team culture that we have is a big part of how we're able to create those products and services. So let's just say that you all have the goal of building a world-leading product or service. And that's a pretty big goal. And when it comes to culture, I'm going to, for the sake of simplicity, divide it into two broad pathways. There is what I will start by calling the Uber pathway. Uber is a ride-sharing app, and they are used all around the world, but they've also been plagued by reports of a toxic culture. So there were reports that came out about driver harassment and issues. There was a video that was particularly bad that showed the CEO yelling at one of their drivers. There were other reports that came out about sexual harassment, other reports about them stealing trade secrets, et cetera, et cetera. And the end of this story is that a couple years ago, investors actually asked the CEO, Travis Kalanick, to step down. So that's one pathway. The other pathway, make it very simple, is that which I think is well represented by Patagonia. So Patagonia is a brand that sells outdoor clothing and gear, and they have all sorts of employee-friendly policies. They have free childcare on site at many of their locations. They donate a percentage of their revenues to environmental charities. And interestingly for them, during the global financial crisis, when most retailers were struggling, they actually had their best 2 years ever. So in this talk, I'm going to share not only why team culture is great for your employees, but also why it's important for building a lasting and successful business. And at the end, I'll give you some tips for things that you can do in your teams to get there. So why does culture matter? Just to get us on the same page, what is culture? At its most surface level, culture is behavior. So it's the things we do on a day-to-day basis with the people we work with. And those behaviors influence how we feel. So, how people interact with me at work might bring up different feelings inside me. And both of those are a reflection of the values of an organization. So I'll give an example of when this works really well. Let's say you're in a meeting, and someone in that meeting does a really wonderful job of making sure that every voice gets heard. So if someone hasn't spoken up yet, they might invite them into the conversation. If someone's speaking a lot, they might gently ask them to pause for a moment so other people can share their views. And those are behaviors that very likely will mean that people in that team, in that room, feel valued and feel included, and they're a great example of the value of inclusivity on a team. That's on the positive side. On the flip side, I've seen some companies where the values messaging externally doesn't match the day-to-day. So there's a company that I've worked with where all of the marketing looks wonderful. Shiny messages on their website and in all of their social media. But when it comes to the day-to-day behaviors, they're quite different. And so it meant that a lot of the people in this organization ended up feeling disengaged, and they had a higher churn rate. So obviously not what we want to be doing. And then this one, pretty obvious, perhaps. So world-leading products and services. By that I mean something that's valued by customers all around the world, and so it captures market share in countries around the world. So with those baseline things out of the way, let's talk about why culture matters. There is a massive amount of research about the impact of employee engagement on things like productivity and profitability. So this research showed 20% higher productivity and profitability with the most engaged employees. Interestingly, Gallup's research, so they do this every year, they found that around the world, 85% of employees are disengaged. So it means that odds are a lot of our teams have quite a bit of work to do around this engagement piece. And the other thing that I think is particularly relevant for tech companies is that we're at the leading edge of this shift to a knowledge economy from an industrial economy. So engagement matters for everyone, but it's one thing to be going into a business and putting the same cog in the same place every day. And it's another thing to go into a company where things are breaking, you'll have to problem solve, we're going to have to think creatively, we're going to have to work with lots of other people in really uncertain environments. And so you can start to see how in a knowledge economy, culture starts to matter even more. And specifically, a healthy culture does mean better products and services. So I'll give two key examples of that around higher performance and more innovation. So the study I like to cite for performance comes from research by Google. It's called Project Aristotle Research. I'm just curious, who's heard of this? I know, okay. Okay, cool. So the rundown is that Google noticed they have this high hiring bar. So they were bringing in people who as individuals performed quite well. But when they put them on teams, their teams were performing at very different levels. And so it was clear that there was something about the combination of these different groups of people that didn't always mean the same outcome. And so being Google and having time and money, they spent 2 years and looked at 200 teams. And the upshot of all of their research was that the #1 driver of team performance was something they called psychological safety. So in terms of behaviors, what that meant is that every week there was an opportunity for everyone's voices on the team to be heard. So people would be contributing in some way or another every single week. And it also meant that if someone on the team looked down or unhappy, someone else would pause and check in on them. So these are types of behaviors that contribute to trust and safety on a team, and it means we perform better. The second example is around innovation. So there's a group called the Center for Talent Innovation, and their research focuses on exactly what it sounds like. And they've found, first of all, that for companies to stay ahead of their peers, they need something called serial innovation. So it's not enough to have one brilliant creative idea. We need to do it over and over and over to stay ahead of our competitors. And the key driver of serial innovation is a diverse and inclusive team. So when they talk about diversity, they mean the demographics of the people in the room, but also their life experiences. So the type of work that they've had, the educational background, maybe the countries that they've lived in or the languages that they speak. And all of that together means that they're getting lots of different perspectives on that team. And the inclusion part is the part where those different perspectives are valued and brought to the forefront. And so, for companies that are scaling and trying to go into new markets, those different perspectives mean that these teams that are diverse and inclusive are 70% more likely to capture that new market. So what we see here is that a healthy culture means that we perform better with the products and services that we're trying to put out into the world today. And it means that we'll be more innovative and better able to come up with the products and services for the future. If that wasn't enough, the other point that is also quite clear is that culture has not only grown in importance, but it will continue to grow in importance. We live in a world where all of the online networks that we have mean that we have much more transparency than we've ever had before, and we're far more connected than we've ever been before. So the implications for that, first of all, for customers and investors are quite large. After I mentioned Uber and some of the scandals that happened, and around that period, there was a campaign called #DeleteUber. When this campaign started, at the time, about 200,000 people deleted Uber from their phones. Within a year, we saw that their market values, their market capitalization, had gone from $70 billion to $50 billion. And interestingly, we now have figures from Lyft, which is their main US competitor, because Lyft IPO'd in the last year. And the figures show that around that same time, Lyft got a big uptick in their own revenue and the numbers of drivers coming through to them. And since then, in the last 2 years, Lyft has actually doubled its market share. So they're now at about 40%. So that's an example where the customers not only have information, they have transparency about what's happening, but we can also see how much customers care about what's happening. And when customers care, investors have to care. So that's where the second statistic comes from. The Wall Street Journal published some research showing that when, back in 1975, 85% of the market value of a company came from the tangible items that they made. So what was the quality of their products or their services? Today, it's actually flipped. And 85% of a company's value comes from the intangibles, and it's only the remaining 15% of the value that comes from the tangibles. And within that 85%, that's in large part driven by things like reputation. So how do customers feel about this company? So that's on that side. On the flip side of why culture is growing importance is around employees. So employees are also very well networked. There was some research that came out from Automatic, so that's the company that created WordPress, and they looked at women engineers who were looking for a job. And they found that when women engineers look for a job, and we could extend this to many other employee groups, I'm sure, they did extensive research. They would not only look at the website and look at the leadership team and see if there were people like them who were on that leadership team, but they would also reach out to their networks and find out who'd worked at that company before and then get candid insights on what the company's like. And in particular, this research from Automatic found that people were looking for the bad experiences. They wanted to avoid, they were watching for red flags, and they wanted to know where to avoid, and this often was because people had been burned before. So, and just in case you're thinking, this is in the US, I can say that from my own experience of being part of some communities for women and non-binary people in tech in New Zealand, I see the same thing happening here when people are looking at a new job. So culture already matters. It's going to continue to grow in importance. The big question is, how can we know where we're at today? And that brings me to measuring culture. The first point I want to make here, though, is that team culture can be quite different from company culture. So company culture, it's of course great to have values. Values help show what makes a workplace a great place to work. It helps guide people to make decisions in new and uncertain situations. When their manager is not there, the value is a decision-making tool. And values are also a great way to get new people inducted into this culture and how it works. So they're great. But we've all worked in companies where maybe the team that we were on was different from other teams, maybe in a better way or a worse way. And I can share an example from a company that we've worked with where they had some diversity and inclusion programs that they ran at a central level that were great. They were really excellent programs. But when it came down to the day-to-day behavior on teams, there were still some pretty toxic behaviors that were happening. So we know that there can be a breakdown between these two. So which is why it's so important to understand where we're at and how consistently our culture is being applied. So these are some of the ways that we've thought about measuring culture and understanding people in the past. So two of the top ways are using surveys and in-person observation. Surveys are when we go out and we ask people how they feel, how they're doing, and there's great insights we can get from surveys, but there's also some challenges, particularly around the fact that we have to have people stop their work to fill out the survey and give us a response. So it can be hard to get 100% participation rates. Feelings are also funny, changing things, and they're very influenced by someone's day. So how someone feels on this particular day will influence their responses, and that could be quite different the following day. And it's also hard to take the insights from surveys and turn them into behaviors and actions. So if we have high engagement, it's not clear what actions to take. And if, say, maybe there's a low belonging score, again, not clear how we translate that to what changes in our day-to-day. So that's on the side of surveys. In-person observation, so with many companies, they might have agile coaches that they bring in to work with their teams, and these are great. And the challenge there, of course, is that it's time-consuming and expensive, and so it's often not something that companies can do with every team. So the new way, it's interesting, it actually draws on a point that Stephen was making earlier today around the fact that we have so much data around us. And so why not tap into that data that's already there and use that to give us some insights about people and what they're doing? And we see that in a few different areas of humans and how we interact with them. So in terms of user behavior, many people are familiar with Google Analytics, which provides analytics on website and website visitors. And that one's great. You hook it up, and then the next week you start getting information about how many people are visiting, what's the page where they drop off, what part of your process might need to be fixed. So we can really quickly get insights without asking our website visitors to do anything different. So that's one area where we see it. Another area where we see this new approach is around the hiring process. So there's a company called Textio that looks at the language and job descriptions and is able to correlate that with how long it takes to fill a role, and also the demographics, in particular the gender breakdown of people who end up applying to that role. So with that data, the people writing the job description can make on-the-spot behavior changes. As they're writing their job description, Textio can say, hey, if you just shifted this word to this word, we predict that you'll have this much of a reduction in the days to fill, or you'll get this much more of an increase in the diversity of genders that are applying. So that's the second example. And then the third example, of course, is around the team side. And our teams, especially in tech, but around the world, people are working on digital tools. We're using software all day, every day. And so with Multitudes, we plug in and we look at those team interactions on that software and then pull out insights. We can do it faster and can tie that to behaviors then that managers and team leaders can change. So that's understanding culture, measuring culture. And I'll end by talking a bit about some steps that you can take today. I'm going to split this into two parts. One is a set of tips for that are baseline. So if you're not doing these, go next week and have some conversations and make them happen. And the other set of tips are for leveling up. And so if the baseline tips seem too basic for you, wait till I get to that next slide, and then I'll share some of those more advanced tips as well. So some culture must-haves. First is around defining the values, and the second is around manager one-on-ones. So defining the values, I spoke a bit before about how important this is, how it helps with decision making. And one of the interesting things that we've seen as a trend around values is that, one, people are starting to use them now more and more as part of their hiring process. So it's understood that this is a great way to filter candidates and figure out if they have some core shared beliefs with other people on our team. The second trend around defining the values is that we want culture add, not culture fit. So this ties in with the data that we've seen about the importance of having really diverse and inclusive teams to be able to stay competitive and stay innovative. I can give an example of culture fit. In an early job, so a job I had early in my career, I was a management consultant and I was traveling a lot. And when we were going into the hiring process, the advice we were often given was hire somebody that you would be okay spending 4 hours in an airport with, because flights are always delayed, and et cetera, et cetera. So here's some laughs. It was genuine hiring advice that we had at the time. And so what's interesting about that is if that's what I'm hiring for, then let's say I'm someone who, if my flight's delayed, I go read a book for 4 hours. Okay, I'll go look for that. Or maybe I'm someone who, if my flight's delayed, I go to a bar and I get a drink and I hang out there for 4 hours. Then I'm looking for that. Neither of those things are important for the actual work. They're completely orthogonal over here. And so that's where we've realized, okay, forget this stuff of just, do we have the same likes and dislikes? And let's get down to the core values. And more importantly, when we're talking about values, even when it's the same value, we know that it can be expressed in very different ways. So let's say that we have a team or a company where one of their values is passion. Maybe they work with small business owners, and their small business owners are passionate about what they do, and they want their team members to be passionate when they're supporting them. Passion can show up in all sorts of areas. Maybe someone is passionate about singing. I have some friends who do that. Maybe someone else is passionate about touch rugby. My husband's in that category. And maybe other people are passionate about their family. Those are all very valid ways to show passion. And when we start to broaden that, then we can both bring in people with shared values, but also get that culture add that we really need for our business to be successful. So that's on that side. In terms of the manager one-on-ones, so this is managers making sure that every 1 to 2 weeks, they sit down and they have a chat with every single one of their direct reports. And this isn't a chat where we talk about the work or the progress made. It's one level up, where we talk about how people are doing, how are the dynamics going on the team. I know for me at least, the times when I did have regular chats with my managers, especially early on in my career, it made it easier for me to know that I could come to them when there were issues. It was one less step if there was something I wanted to talk about, because I knew we were going to have that chat. And so instead of figuring out how to get the manager into a room for a conversation, I just had to figure out how I would explain what was going on. So that reliability of the regular manager one-on-ones is something that builds a lot of trust on that team. Okay, so this is the baseline. Now I'm going to talk about those who've covered these, long gone, well done, and want to think about leveling up. And when it comes to leveling up, the key here is about building a learning organization. So this ties into something else that Stephen was saying earlier about the importance of being adaptive. We know that we need to keep adapting with our products and services. We should do the exact same thing with our culture and stay agile and adaptive with that as well. So how can we do that? 2 key tips here. One is around making it safe to contribute in our workplaces, and the second is around pausing. So on the side of making it safe to contribute, this really flows from the Google research I mentioned earlier. We want to have workplaces where we're hearing from everyone on a regular basis. And if we're not hearing from everyone on a regular basis, it might be a sign that there are some gaps in the safety or the trust that we've built on our teams. So these last 2 points here are tips around how you can start to build that safety and that trust. One of them is a code of conduct. This goes nicely with a set of values. So where a set of values says what we aspire to do, a code of conduct gives some gentle guidelines around the things that we are not okay with in our organization. And it also brings in some accountability and reporting pathways. The key thing about a code of conduct is that it's lighter than an official HR report. And so it often it means that it's less of a big deal, and it helps people to be a little bit more free and open with those conversations about both behaviors that are great, but also feedback on behaviors that maybe made people feel uncomfortable. So that's the code of conduct. The other tip around safety and trust is building up allyship within your organization. So allyship is when people stand up at work and raise their voice to stand with others who perhaps are being targeted or marginalized. And there's a lot of power that comes in standing with someone else, not just standing for yourself. And so there's all sorts of ways that you can start to develop that in your organization. One pathway is an ally skills workshop. I've also seen organizations start a Slack channel around this and have meetups where they get people to chat about tricky, awkward situations where someone wanted to say something but wasn't sure what to say, and other people can help them out. So that's on the making it safe to contribute side. And then the second is on the pausing side. And for this one, I'll start with a story. So there's another team that I've worked with where every time there was a deadline, they would race to the finish. So it would be a massive push. People wouldn't sleep. They wouldn't see their families. They wouldn't see their friends. And they, every single time, would scrape by just at the last minute. And it would end up working the way they wanted it to. And everyone would kind of take a big breath and pause, and then get right back into it and do another massive push for the next deadline. And so you can imagine that's something that works maybe once or twice, but eventually people just burn out. And it's not a pace that people can sustain. And so for this particular team, it was that there was a systemic issue around how they prioritized, or in this case, didn't prioritize. And what they really needed to do was pause and look at the processes they had around that prioritizing. And so the bigger point here is when we're stuck in doing the work, we're not able to pull our heads up and figure out how to improve the ways that we're doing that work. And that's why building in those regular pauses matters so much. So it's the regular retros, the manager one-on-ones are one example of a pause, and also having some of those measurement tools, be it surveys or observation or some of the more passive data collection methods. Those are also other ways to help us step back and get a sense of the bigger picture. So to recap, the baseline tips were defining your values and having manager one-on-ones. And then the leveling up tips for becoming a learning organization. We're making it safe for everyone to contribute. Once you've done the hard work of hiring a diverse set of people, making sure that you're benefiting from all those wonderful different perspectives that you have in the room. And then pausing so that you're always improving your systems and how you actually get things done together. And with that, I'll go back to the organizations we saw at the start. So by now, I hope that it's clear that what's amazing about Uber is not that they built a world-leading product, it's that they did it with such a toxic culture. And the other question is, how much longer will Uber be able to continue? If you look at the history of both of these organizations, Uber has been around for about a decade. Patagonia has been around for about 50 years. So I wish you all the best with your culture journeys and with creating long-lasting, successful organizations. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. We have a few questions. If there's still a little bit of time to put your question through Slido, if you have one. So I'm going to start off with the one that probably has the longest answer. So how does a company with old-fashioned workplace culture change to become more welcoming and inclusive while bringing longer-serving employees on that journey?
Yeah, okay. It's a great question. So from what I've seen, there's always this debate, does change need to be top-down or bottom-up? And it ultimately needs to be both ways, in my experience. So one question would be, and this is one that the Ally Skills team would ask if we were going into an organization, is the leadership on board with this? So genuinely, and not sort of we want some good PR, but are we genuinely ready to do some hard work and make this shift? And then the second question, if that's a yes, then the second question is, are there people inside the organization? It doesn't have to be everyone, but at least for a start, there those champions who are really excited about spearheading work? And I think as long as those two things are there, that's enough to get started. But if those aren't there, that's really the foundation that we need. And then, once those are there and they've made that commitment, there's all sorts of resources that I could point to. If you go to the allyskills.nz, we have a free toolkit for starting on this journey. Change Catalyst is another organization that has some great work. So there's, once that's there, the resources and the information about the next steps are out there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Kind of along the same lines, how does a company come back from a bad cultural experience?
Yeah. So I think one, the recognition is important, recognizing that something has happened, and the apology. When there's a bad cultural experience, it's breaking trust. And it's breaking trust both with team members, but it's also breaking trust with customers. And then, as we saw, that can lead to broken trust with investors. And so the first way is to recognize, yep, this isn't okay, and we don't want this to happen here. And then the second thing is doing, maybe they have a code of conduct, maybe they don't, it's time to get one. But thinking about accountability. So what are the guardrails that they're putting in place so that people in the future know this is what's okay? And one of the great things, so for a code of conduct, for example, it's used in a lot of tech conferences. So NetHui is they've done a big revamp in their process, and they have a very public code of conduct. And what organizations like that have said is that simply by having it out there and saying, hey, here's where the guardrails are. These are the behaviors that aren't okay. These are the ones that are great. It actually reduces the number of incidents in the first place because it's clear all of a sudden. And so, having that clarity can also do a lot to rebuild trust.
Awesome. Here's a philosophical question.
Okay.
You might not have the answer. If diversity is so important to productivity, why is it so hard for experienced immigrant tech workers to get their first jobs in New Zealand?
That's a multi-layered question. So I guess there's a lot of systemic things that are at play here. I have a few thoughts on this one. So one of the reasons that diversity matters is because people with different perspectives and experiences can slot into different types of roles. So for example, with neurodiverse people, so that's people who have autism or whose brains work differently from those of us who are neurotypical, there's been some great research. It was, IBM, and then there were a few other companies that have really led the way on making sure that they have pathways for neurodiverse people into their organizations. And what they found is that they're often excited about very different work from neurotypical people. And so it's sometimes not just saying, cool, well, you seem different, so I'm going to put you in the same thing that someone else was doing. It's saying, okay, you're different, and so what are the different skill sets and motivations that you have, and maybe slotting someone into a spot based on that. So I think that's one. The second thing to acknowledge is that for migrant workers, there are, of course, some systemic barriers around language. It's been interesting. So I wouldn't call myself, how do I say it? Because I'm American, I would say my process of integrating into New Zealand was relatively streamlined, and my husband's Kiwi, so there are a bunch of things that help there. But New Zealand is small enough that a lot still happens on networks and relationships. And so it's been interesting for me, I've been here now for 3.5 years, and getting those first roles was quite hard. And then I've noticed that since then, because someone knew me and could say to their friend, oh, hey, this is the type of work that Lauren does, it just sort of sped up and got much, much easier. And so I think also there's just a bit of a gap around kind of those first steps in helping people break in.
Networks are important.
Yeah.
Final question for Lauren. Could you just explain a little bit about what Ally Skills is? Because a few people did not know in the audience.
Oh, yes, definitely. So Ally Skills, do you think it's the organization or the concept?
Either one.
Either one. Okay. So the concept of allyship is that, what's the brief version? So there are all sorts of aspects to anyone's identity, right? There's gender, There's body size as an aspect of identity. There's how our brains work. I mentioned that one already. Ethnicity, we could there's if you're a caregiver for a family member or not, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the core premises of allyship is saying, okay, great. There might be some areas where I experience marginalization. So as a woman in tech, we all have stories. So that's an area where I experience marginalization. But there are other areas where I could be an ally. So for example, as a white person, there are plenty of places where I could be an ally. Or as someone who, with the body size that I have, I can be an ally when there's fat shaming happening, for example. And so the concept of allyship is saying, being able to kind of step outside of ourselves and look at what are the things that are happening that might be hard for other people, and now how can I get in there and use my voice to create a workplace that's better for all of those other people. So that's what I mean when I say we're standing with other groups and not just for ourselves. I won't go into all the research, but it's much more effective in terms of creating change when we're standing with others and supporting others. So that's kind of the concept, and then Ally Skills NZ does work in that space.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Everyone, let's thank Lauren for speaking today.